Somebody write this down. We've got a real sea story here. The laughter that followed was the particular laughter of a wardroom full of junior officers who have found an object for their afternoon and intend to make the most of it. Not vicious, not calculated, but the unthinking laughter of people who are certain they are among their own kind and have not yet understood that they are not. It moved through the officers' lounge at Naval Station Norfolk with the ease of sound that knows it belongs in a space and does not trouble itself about who else might be present. Lieutenant Commander Brian Taggart was 34 years old and stood at the edge of the gathering with a coffee in one hand and the expression of a man who has identified entertainment and stepped toward it with the comfortable reflex of someone who is used to being the sharpest person. In most rooms, he was handsome in the regulation way of men who have been successful in competitive institutions and know it, and he wore his khakis with the crispness of a man for whom the uniform is partly a performance of the self. The object of the room's attention was an old man in the middle of a story. Calhoun Ward was 83 years old. He sat in one of the leather chairs near the window that looked over the harbor, gray ships at their moorings in the November light, wearing a faded blue flannel shirt, dark trousers, and worn leather shoes polished until the leather had gone the quality of old amber. His hands rested in his lap, large, the knuckles heavy and pronounced, the fingers carrying the faint tremor of age visible only at rest. His eyes were pale gray, the color of harbor water on a cloudy morning, and they held a quality like looking across a long distance, focused on something further away than the room. He had been telling a story. Petty Officer First Class Ramirez, 26, assigned to the lounge for the afternoon's reception, had sat down beside him when the old man had looked like he might appreciate company, and had been listening with the quality of attention that young people give to old people when they understand there is something on offer that cannot be found anywhere else. The story was about a submarine, about a night in the North Atlantic in 1962 during the 13 days in October when the world had come as close as it has ever publicly come to ending, and what it was like to be inside a submarine that had been depth-charged for 3 hours by American destroyers, and what the commanding officer had said, and what the decision had been, and what had happened after. Taggart had caught the edges of it, 1962, North Atlantic, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and had produced the particular smile of a man who has identified a tall tale and is about to offer the room his assessment of it. He stepped closer. "Hold on," he said. "You're saying you were on a Soviet submarine during the Cuban Missile Crisis?" He looked at his audience. It was with him. "A Soviet submarine?" "Yes," Calhoun said. His voice was a low, unhurried thing, the cadence of a man accustomed to saying true things that people find surprising. "I was an intelligence asset embedded with the Northern Fleet. I was aboard B-59 for 11 months. B-59, Taggart repeated. He looked at the officers, 7 now, drawn by momentum. The one that came within one officer's vote of launching a nuclear torpedo. The vote was not as close as the histories say, Calhoun said. The second officer was not going to authorize it. He was a reasonable man. I knew him. Taggart turned to the room. He knew him. Laughter, sir. With respect, that is one of the finest sea stories I've heard in 14 years of service. The thing about sea stories is they grow with the telling. He set his coffee on the table beside Calhoun with the comfortable authority of a man at home in his territory. What were you actually doing in 1962? Navy? Merchant Marine? Intelligence, Calhoun said. Office of Naval Intelligence. I was 22 years old. I spoke Russian. Recruited out of Georgetown in 1959, a poor kid from rural Georgia with unusual test scores who was willing to do things other people found inadvisable. Sir, Do you know what the ONI's declassified records show about asset placement on Soviet submarines during the missile crisis? No, Calhoun said. Nothing, Taggart said. Because it didn't happen. The operational security requirements alone would have made it. The records are not all declassified, Calhoun said. Simply, Taggart laughed. An honest laugh this time, surprised out of him by the persistence of the story, and he reached out and patted Calhoun Ward on the shoulder. Once, twice, the tap of a man who is fond of a person he is not taking seriously. All right, he said. I'll give you this one. Best sea story of the year. He picked up his coffee. What was the commanding officer's name? The one who was going to launch the torpedo? Savitsky, Calhoun said. Valentin Savitsky. He died in 1999. He was a good man who was very frightened. I understood him. The room went quiet in a different way. Taggart's smile had not left his face, but it had changed quality. He looked at the old man, at the flannel shirt, the worn shoes, the hands in the lap with the faint tremor, the pale gray eyes that were looking past him at something farther away, and he felt, briefly and against his will, the specific unease of a man who suspects he has been misreading a document. Then he recovered. He patted the shoulder again, lighter this time. All right, old-timer, we'll verify the records after. The harbor smell dropped away. The sound was machinery. The specific sound of a submarine underway, not the surface world's open frequencies, but the close, pressured acoustics of a metal cylinder moving through dark water, every surface reverberating, the engines a constant presence beneath everything, the sonar a slow, patient inquiry into the surrounding black. The air smelled of diesel and sweat, and the particular human quality of men who have been in a sealed space for weeks. He was 22 years old. He was in the aft torpedo room of B-59, a Soviet Foxtrot-class submarine, and it was October 27, 1962. And the submarine had been running on battery power for 16 hours, because surfacing meant being seen, and being seen meant something the commanding officer was not yet prepared to decide about. His name on the boat was Nikolai. He had been aboard for 4 months, in the cover of a junior sonar technician, using the Russian that had gotten him recruited, and the specific talent for invisibility he had developed growing up very poor, in a place where invisibility was a necessary skill. The depth charges had been running for 3 hours. American destroyers were above them. He recognized them by sound signature, which carried a specific quality of wrongness when the signatures were American. Because they were his, in a way the submarine never was, and he was providing them with what they needed to locate B-59, through a method that was the part of the story the records did not contain. Captain Savitsky was in the forward compartment. The temperature had reached 122 degrees Fahrenheit. Several crew members had lost consciousness. The carbon dioxide levels were climbing in a way that affected judgment, and Calhoun had been watching the officers around him deteriorate for 4 hours, with the attention of a man who understands that the difference between a decision at full clarity and one made at 70% is not always visible from the outside. Savitsky had been talking about the torpedo. The torpedo was a T-5 nuclear-tipped weapon. Its yield was estimated at 15 kilotons. Its target, if authorized, would have been the destroyer above them that had been dropping depth charges for 3 hours. The destroyer above them was the US Beale. The Beale had 300 men aboard. There were 3 officers required to authorize the launch: Savitsky, the political officer Ivan Maslenikov, and the flotilla commander Vasily Arkhipov, who was aboard by circumstance, and whose presence on B-59 was itself the kind of coincidence that makes historians grateful for coincidence. Arkhipov had said no. Maslenikov had been silent, which, in the operational logic of that moment, was not a no, and was not a yes, and the silence had lasted 40 seconds. And in those 40 seconds, Calhoun Ward had done the thing he had been on the submarine to do if this moment arrived. And the moment had arrived. He had spoken to Maslenikov in a conversation that lasted 6 minutes, and that he had never fully described to anyone, and would not describe now, and Maslenikov had said no. The torpedo was not launched. The Beale sailed home with 300 men. The submarine surfaced before midnight and was escorted by American vessels. Calhoun Ward was transferred by small boat in the dark, soaking wet, to an American destroyer, and a man in civilian clothes shook his hand on the deck and said, in English, "We know what you did. It will not be spoken of." He had been 22 years old. He had been very cold, and very certain that the cold was a thing he was going to survive, which was the most he had allowed himself to be certain of for the previous 4 months. A week later, in a gray building in Langley, Virginia, a man who identified himself only as the deputy director pressed a small pin into Calhoun's palm. It was a plain thing, dark metal, no visible insignia, the kind of recognition that exists only because the one being recognized will know what it means. "There are 7 of these," the deputy director said. "One for each member of the operation. You earned yours twice over." He looked at Calhoun for a moment, the way men in certain positions look at people who have done certain things. What you prevented will not appear in any history for a very long time. Possibly not in your lifetime. That is the nature of this work. He closed Calhoun's fingers around the pin. Carry it anyway. Calhoun had carried it in his breast pocket every day since 61 years. He blinked. The lounge came back, the leather chairs, the harbor light, the gray ships at their moorings. Taggart's hand was still on his shoulder. Petty Officer First Class Ramirez had been sitting very still for the last 8 minutes. He had been sitting still in the specific way of someone who is computing several things at once and does not want to interrupt the computation with movement. He had been listening to every word of the story since the old man sat down 40 minutes ago, and he had been listening with the quality of attention that certain people have for stories told by people who are not performing, because the absence of performance in a story was itself a kind of signal, and the old man was not performing. He had also noticed the pin, not in the breast pocket where it was kept. He hadn't seen that. He had noticed the way the old man touched his breast pocket periodically, the unconscious contact that a person maintains with something they carry, and he had been on enough deployments and stood enough watches with enough senior enlisted sailors to know that the things people touch without knowing they are touching them are the things that matter. Ramirez was not in a position to address Taggart directly. Taggart was a lieutenant commander. Ramirez was a petty officer first class. The power structure in the room was entirely vertical, and he was at the base of it. But he had been given access to the base library's officer history records for a project he was completing. And he had a phone, and he had a chief petty officer named Holloway who had 30 years in naval intelligence and who picked up his phone on the second ring. Ramirez walked to the far corner of the room, facing the window, and made the call. He said the date. October 27th, 1962, he said the submarine. B-59, Foxtrot class, North Atlantic. He said the name Savitsky. He said, "The old man says he was on it. He says Oni. He says there's a pin from Langley." He paused. "He's not lying, Chief. I know what lying sounds like. He's not lying." The silence on the other end of the line arrived between the last syllable and the next breath, and it lasted for 5 full seconds, and it was not the silence of a man running a search. It was the silence of a man who already knows. "Say the name," Holloway said. "He hasn't given a name," Ramirez said. "He's just an old man in the lounge." "Describe him." Ramirez described him. Flannel shirt, worn shoes, large hands, pale gray eyes, 80 maybe more. Breast pocket he keeps touching. Another silence. Shorter, Ramirez, Holloway said. I need you to listen to me carefully. I need you to stay in that room, and I need you to make sure no one else puts hands on that man. I am making a call right now. This call is going to go to the base commander's office. I want you to understand what that means. He paused. The man in the lounge is one of 4 people still living who know what actually happened on B-59 on October 27, 1962. I can't tell you more than that, but I need you to stay close to him. Ramirez put his phone in his pocket and walked back to the leather chair beside the old man and sat down and looked at Calhoun Ward, who looked back at him with the pale gray eyes. Someone's coming, Ramirez said quietly. Calhoun looked at him for a moment. Something in the pale eyes, not surprise. Something older than surprise. I know, he said, and looked back at the harbor. The call from Holloway went to the base duty officer, who was on a second line within seconds. The name Holloway had produced was one he had been briefed on when he took this posting. With a single instruction, if you ever hear this name in a public context, call me directly. He called directly. Rear Admiral Catherine Solis, Post Commander, 2 stars, 29 years of service, was in a meeting when her aide showed her a note. She read it twice. She said, "Excuse me," and walked out. Her aide, briefed on the same name by the same predecessor, was already moving. Solis had read the B-59 account, the classified portions, the declassified portions, the considerable territory between them. She had read the name of the American asset that was redacted in every version she'd ever seen, and her predecessor had told her, if you ever encounter a man of a certain age with a certain kind of pin at this installation, understand that the redaction has a living face. She walked across the base at a pace that made her aide work. She came through the door of the officer's lounge with the contained velocity of a person who has been moving toward something important and has arrived. Her eyes found the leather chairs by the window. They found the flannel shirt. They found the pale gray eyes already looking at her. She walked directly to Calhoun Ward. She did not look at Taggart. She did not acknowledge the 7 officers who had been laughing 5 minutes ago, and who were now arranged around the leather chairs in the specific stillness of people who have begun to understand that they have been present at something they did not initially recognize as significant. She crossed the room with the focus of a woman who has one destination, and it is the old man in the good chair by the harbor window. She saw Taggart's hand still resting on Calhoun Ward's shoulder. Something moved in her jaw. Taggart's hand came off the shoulder. Rear Admiral Catherine Solis came to attention in front of Calhoun Ward and rendered the sharpest, most breathtakingly precise salute that Brian Taggart had witnessed in 14 years of commissioned service. It was absolute. Not a courtesy salute between officers, not the brisk exchange of a senior acknowledging a junior, but the salute of a person who has been carrying the knowledge of a debt for a long time and is in the presence, for the first time, of the person to whom it is owed. She held it directed at the old man in the flannel shirt. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. The room was completely still. Calhoun Ward looked at the Admiral for a moment. Then he raised his right hand, heavy-knuckled, the tremor gone, the hand of a man who served, and returned the salute with the precision of a man who learned this gesture when it was still connected to things that cost something. He lowered it. She lowered hers. Taggart had gone the color of old chalk. Admiral Solis did not produce a document. She had not brought one, because the documents she could have brought were not documents she could produce in this room, and what she knew without them. She turned to the assembled officers and spoke without raising her voice. I'm going to tell you what I know. and I want every officer present to understand what they were laughing at. In October of 1962, a United States Navy intelligence asset was aboard a Soviet Foxtrot-class submarine in the North Atlantic. The submarine was B-59. You know what B-59 is. You know the flotilla commander cast the deciding vote against launching a nuclear weapon at a United States Navy vessel. What the declassified record does not contain, what I was briefed on when I took this command, is that the vote was not cast in isolation. She paused. There was an American aboard who had lived inside that crew for months, who understood the human architecture of that moment, not the politics, but the men. Which one was reasonable? Which one was afraid? Which one could be reached? He reached the one who could be reached, in a conversation that lasted 6 minutes on a submarine at 122 degrees, with American depth charges running above it. And the torpedo was not launched. The lounge was absolutely still. The Usbeil had 300 men aboard, she said. If that torpedo had launched, the American response protocol for a nuclear deployment against a Navy vessel would have activated. Historians who have modeled the consequences do not agree on scale. They agree it would not have been small. She looked at the room. Calhoun James Ward, who has been sitting here telling a story this room was laughing at, is one of 4 people still living who know what actually happened on B-59. His file is classified above this installation. His name has been redacted in every public version of the account. She looked at Taggart. The story he was telling you was true. Every word of it was true. It has always been true. She paused. He was 22 years old. The silence was of a kind the room had not previously contained. Taggart's coffee cup was in his hand. He did not appear to know it was in his hand. The consequences for Taggart were not dramatic in the way that produces paperwork. They were the quieter consequences that live in the way a room changes when you enter it for a period of months, the way certain conversations pause, the way a senior officer looks at you for just a moment too long before moving on. He was talented. He was not destroyed. He was, over the following year, very specifically and deliberately corrected by people who understood the difference between a career worth saving and a character worth shaping. Calhoun Ward stayed for the ceremony. Several officers came to him one at a time and sat in the chair beside him and listened in the right way, and he told them things, not the classified things, not the architecture of the 6-minute conversation, but things about what it was like to be 22 and very cold and very certain the cold was survivable. Things about Savitsky, who was a good man who was very frightened. Things about the harbor at Murmansk, which was gray and cold and looked like Norfolk on a November morning. Taggart came last. He came to the chair with the difficulty of a man crossing a distance that is not measured in feet. He sat down. He did not make a speech. He put his hand on the armrest of the old man's chair, not on Calhoun himself, but on the chair. The closest he could get to what he wanted to say without yet having the words for it. Calhoun looked at the hand on the armrest. Then he looked at Taggart with the pale gray eyes. "You know what it feels like," he said, "when you're very sure about something and then you find out you were wrong about the size of it?" Taggart said, "Yes, sir." "Good," Calhoun said. "That feeling is the beginning of the thing you need to become." He looked back at the harbor, the gray ships, the November light. The sea stories that sound the tallest are often the truest ones. The ones that are true are often the ones where the person telling them has spent 60 years wondering whether anyone would believe them. He was quiet for a moment. "I am very glad you are here today." He said it without irony and without unkindness, and without the need for the room to respond, and Taggart sat with it in the leather chair beside the harbor window and understood that he had been given something that he would carry for the rest of his career, and that he had not earned it, and that it had been given to him anyway, and that the appropriate response was not to talk about it. It was 6 weeks later, a Sunday morning, at a waterfront diner in Norfolk, the kind of place with a view of the harbor and coffee that had been brewing long enough to mean it, when Taggart saw the flannel shirt through the window. He was inside before the glass door closed behind him. Mr. Ward, Calhoun Ward, looked up from a cup of coffee and the harbor view with the pale gray eyes. Taggart sat down across the table without ceremony. "I've been thinking about what to say to you for 6 weeks," he said. "I want to say it now, without an audience, which I think is the right way to do it." He looked at the old man. "I was performing. I found someone I thought I could perform at, and I did, and everything I said was wrong, and the way I said it was worse than what I said. You deserved none of it." He paused. "I'm sorry." Calhoun Ward looked at him with the long, steady quality of his attention. Then he picked up the coffee menu from the table and held it out. "The Americano is good here," he said. "The eggs are better. Order something and sit down properly. You're perched on the edge of that seat like a man waiting for permission to exist." Taggart looked at the menu. Something moved in his face that had not been there 6 weeks ago. "Yes, sir," he said. They sat for 2 hours. Taggart asked one question, not about B-59, not about the vote, not about Savitsky, but about what it was like to go back. To cross from the world he'd been in for a year back into the American world that did not know what had almost happened. Calhoun was quiet for a moment. Then, he said it was strange for a long time, then ordinary. Then there were years he thought about it every day, and years he didn't. And now there were days he sat by the water and felt the weight of a decision made in a sealed room, and understood that the weight was not a burden, but a record, and that carrying a record was not the same as being trapped by one. Taggart did not write any of it down. He carried all of it. The men who went into the places we have never heard of and did the things that kept the world from becoming something else do not announce themselves. They are in waterfront diners and officers' lounges, telling stories that sound too large to be true. And the stories are true, and they have been true for 60 years. And the only thing that was ever required of the rest of us was to listen. If you were moved by Calhoun's story of quiet courage and timeless wisdom, hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to see it, and be sure to subscribe to Veterans Valor for more stories of America's unassuming heroes, and click that notification bell so you never miss a story of the quiet warriors who walk among us.